All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to cover really quickly the main regions and areas of a biopsychosocial that we want to use. Once we're, starting to compile our assessment, and really that's what we want to do with a biopsychosocial. We want to start to take the information that we're gathering from the client themselves, from collateral sources, from histories, and we want to place them in the context of their biology, psychology, and social world so that we can start to see connections and utilize theory to figure out what the treatment plan is. The biopsychosocial is incredibly helpful when putting together a diagnosis for someone because you can hopefully clearly see and identify the symptom criteria, the risk factors, the prognostic factors when we do a complete and thorough history. Now, the case studies that you got for the assignment are not as in-depth as you would want them to be, but they are sort of what you usually end up getting when you first see a client. So there'll be time for us to talk about how to flesh those out when you're given those sort of small bits and pieces of information, but they'll be useful and definitely will work for the assignment. If you do the assignment with actual clients, you'll find that you're able to take this in a more broad and more in-depth way. So for today, just to let you know, I'm using myself as a bit of an example. Most of what I'm saying about myself in the biopsychosocial is not accurate, so I'm not fully self-disclosing my life to you, but I thought it would be kind of fun to use the concept of me to demonstrate. So we'll go through each region. I'll talk a little bit about what you're trying to gather, how you're starting to focus some things. Now this, I'm using the template that you were shown in our last PowerPoint from our last in-person class. And you can use that, but I'm also going to talk about a couple of regions that aren't mentioned in there and just sort of some of the things that you're going to want to get, even though they're not listed in the PowerPoint. The discussion, I'll talk about how you would bring some of that information in. So real quick, I'm just going to share the screen with you. And all right, so you should see biopsychosocial really quickly. I want to minimize my face. All right. Okay, so as we go through here, this is a link, just another link to that template. So you can click on that and follow along with it, or you can kind of use it as a guidepost for the work that you're going to be doing. So we'll start right off the bat, like with the presenting problem. Now, in this, we want to get a sense of why the client has arrived. Like, throughout the rest of the assessment process, you're going to start to see things that you're going to connect with the presenting problem, but you want to get a really clear and concise picture. The first section, these are the basic demographic information: name, age, race, gender. Make sure that you put in the person's pronouns so that anyone reading this can refer to them the way that they should be referred to. You want to identify housing, marital status, immediate family members, meaning like living in the home with them, and then their statement of what the initial problem is. And it doesn't have to be long. You want to put it in a narrative fashion unless you're using an assessment. But as you'll notice, the assessment examples I showed you at the end ask you to take all of the information and put it into a narrative also. So your first section might read something like: Stephen Dawson is a 43-year-old white male, pronouns he and him, currently domiciled in a home in Clarence, New York. Stephen lives with his wife, Vanessa, age 35. Stephen has no children, but several pets, including cats, rabbit, and chickens. Stephen presented to the clinic for help with feelings of anxiety. He states the problem began about a month ago, and he attributes it to starting a new job and not knowing how to use the Blackboard software. So after you kind of get that quick little snapshot of what's going on, you want to start to look at, well, what is it that would make starting this new job and not knowing this information such a high anxiety item for Steve? Right? So we want to start to look at some of the background, the personal status. And in this, we want to get a good picture of the person within their historical environment, right? So you want to include things like family of origin. Were the parents together? Did he know his biological parents? Did he not know? Was there foster care? So you want to identify the place of birth, include any major moves, what age the moves occurred if the person can remember. Also, any information provided about what those experiences were like. Now, if you're doing the full one here with our example, this would be a very long section, but I just kind of gave a really quick snapshot. But you also want to look for any information that would show a connection between the person and the problem, right? So example, Stephen was born in Buffalo, New York, to Jim, 75, and Mary Ann, deceased, 65, meaning that she died when she was 65. Dawson, he has one brother, John, deceased at 48. John died 3 weeks prior to the intake. He also has two sisters, Michaeline, 35, and Amanda, 33. Stephen reports that his family moved around a lot when he was young. You want to use quotes. Quotes are great. He reports living in Jamestown, New York, Minnesota, California, and Idaho, all before the age of 12. He has recently moved back to the Buffalo area from New York City, where he has lived the past 15 years. He was commuting from New York to Buffalo until starting his new job in September. And of course, New York should be capitalized. So this would be longer. You would include each place that he had lived and the ages, if he could remember those things. You might want a little bit more information about death of the mother, death of the father. You'd want to get a little bit more about what his experience was like with those moves. But already you're starting to see a bit of a picture, right? This is someone who has had, in the last number of years, a great deal of loss, as well as someone who moved around a lot during some really important attachment ages during his childhood. And also not just moved around like an area, he moved into unique and different cultures. Jamestown, New York, Minnesota, California, Idaho, all before really being a teenager. So those are things that you want to kind of file back in your mind, because you're dealing with someone who's saying they're experiencing anxiety with new change, a new move, a new job. So there's something about the newness, right? So drug history and current use. In this section, you really want to get as clear of a picture of what is happening with this person in regards to substance use. And not just problematic. You want to understand if the person is using drugs or medication, even if they're not prescribed medications, in a way that's helpful, right? So you want to talk about the recreational drugs, alcohol, tobacco, any medications that are being taken over the prescribed dose. So say he was getting Vicodin for a toothache, and he was supposed to take 10 milligrams and he was taking 20 milligrams a day. You'd want to know about that. Or if he was taking them without a prescription, if he had been prescribed opiates for a back injury and they were no longer prescribed, but he was buying them from a friend because the injury was still there, you'd want to get that information. You also want to find out about any history of substance use treatment, including treatment that might have been at a very young age, and what the results of those things would be. For the purpose of the example, I'll pretend that I have somewhat of a use history. Stephen reports experimenting with cannabis as a teen, but states it never really took. I used a bit in college, but nothing for the past 20 years. He states he consumes 2 to 3 glasses of wine a week, has been intoxicated 2 to 3 times in the last year, does not drink alone, only at social gatherings, denies any history of blackouts or withdrawal symptoms. He denies use of any other drugs and states he takes no prescription medication. He has no prior treatment history and reports no increase in alcohol use and does not make any connection between his use and his current problem. So you're getting his perspective. Now, you might eventually interview the wife or a parent or anyone else that might be involved in the case, and you might find out other things. That's why we want to use the language of like he denies, right? And when you put collateral in, if there had been like a disagreement, he says he denies history of blackouts or withdrawal symptoms, yet upon interviewing collateral, Vanessa, wife, reports him needing to drink early in the morning and blacking out 2 weeks ago and not remembering what happened the night before. So if there's something that's contradicting the person's statement that you find out from another place, you want to list where that source of contradiction comes from and what that individual's report was. So medical history and current status. Now, some people combine this with the mental health. I think you should do 2 sections. I'm sticking to what I gave you in the template. If you were doing this as the combined, you would definitely want to make sure that you are including the concept of illness as mental health, for the lack of a better term, mental illness as well as medical illness or injury. So a lot of times this is driven by the agency. If you're working in a psychiatric unit, then obviously you're going to be more focused on the psychiatric piece. If you're working in a hospital, you're going to be more focused on the medical. Either way, you want this to be as thorough as possible. So any history of major medical illness or injury, this should always include head injury because head injuries can mimic a lot of mental health issues. You also want to find out how they were treated what medications, what their experience with the medication was. Did it work? Did it not work? Were there side effects? Any allergies to medications and their reaction presentation. Any known family history of illness. This, of course, would include mental health issues. Any current concerns about their health, any current changes in weight, appetite, or sleep pattern. All three of those can be indicative of something like depression. It could be a triggering episode for mania. And then any current health goals that the person might want to work on, because then there's some motivation within a health goal, and you might be able to include that in a treatment plan in some way. So if you were including the mental health stuff, you would want to include any history of hospitalizations, how long those hospitalizations were. Anytime we see somebody hospitalized for mental health issues for more than 30 days, it really suggests an intensity of that experience. You want to check for suicidality, a history of homicidality, any history of hallucinations, things of that nature. So an example, Stephen denies any history of medical illness. He reports an allergy to penicillin that produces anaphylactic shock. He is prescribed an EpiPen for this. He reports no recent head injuries, but does state he had 2 concussions when he was a young child, 9 and 11 years old. He had a recent MRI due to a dizzy spell that turned out to be a vitamin deficiency. The MRI was normal. He had a recent vitamin D deficiency 2 years ago, which led to some issues with balance and mood, but these were treated with D injections and no symptoms are currently present. He currently takes a vitamin D supplement and states he takes it every day as prescribed. Stephen states his brother had diabetes and this is what caused his death. Other than that, he does not know of any other family medical issues. He denies any current medical concerns. He reports his weight and appetite have been normal, but that his sleep has been bothered by thoughts and worry. He states he usually gets 7 hours of uninterrupted sleep, but now he gets about 5 with frequent interruptions. He has no current health goals, but does report he has been vegan for the past 15 years. So when you start to see that vitamin deficiency, even if he's treating the D, you definitely want, because there's an intake in anxiety and some changes in sleep, you want to get another complete vitamin panel done for someone like this, right? And just because he says that he does not know of any other family medical issues doesn't mean that they don't exist. So you want to make sure that he states this or he does not know of anything else, because collateral might back it up and you might find that there's a long history of panic attacks. It might be a long history of mental health issues within the family, things like that. Family history and current relationships. So you want to get a sense of the family the client grew up in, what his current relationships are like. So you want to look at family of origin, composition, members, their occupations, parenting style, current relationships with the family, with their family now, current relationships, immediate relationships, and friendships. So example, Stephen describes growing up in a chaotic house. His father was a traveling salesman and was on the road a lot. His mother was a homemaker and eventually started working as a full-time teacher. He describes his brother as overbearing and mean. He had a strong relationship with his sister, Michaeline, but not such a strong relationship with his youngest sister. He states his father was a good father, that he was strict but fair. He reports his mother died unexpectedly 5 years ago during a routine medical procedure. He currently reports having strong connections to his family and sees them regularly since moving back to Buffalo. Stephen has been married for 10 years and refers to the marriage as magical. He and his wife have no children, but he says, we have the animals and that works for us. So there's a lot you could unpack in this statement here, right? So chaotic, he uses that word, but then the description doesn't sound all that chaotic, right? So you would probably want to dig in a little bit more to what overbearing and mean meant. Eventually in therapy, you'd probably want to explore what it means to have his brother just died, a brother who was overbearing and mean, what role that played in his life. Looking at the idea that a traveling salesman as a father was on the road a lot, you'd want to know what a lot means. Because again, this was all happening during really important attachment moments in his life. And if you're working towards a diagnosis of like an adjustment disorder with anxious features, these constant in and out attachments within his life, plus the recent deaths, could make something like a move and a new job that much more difficult for a person to adjust to. So positive supports. Here we want to get a sense of the environmental strengths: friends, groups, clubs, affiliations, religions, social life, hobbies. So the example, Stephen stated he has a good support system. His best friends, Greg and Giovanni, have been in his life over 20 years and are a constant support. He belongs to a local Buddhist Sangha where he meditates each week and engages in events. He is a hobbyist sleight of hand magician. Some of that's actually true. Forensic history. This can be important for the folks that we're working with to give us an understanding of past traumas or past moments of shame, all those different types of things. So you want to talk about history of arrests, of history of confinement, jails, prisons, juvenile detention, family history, current status with probation or parole, and then the example, Stephen denies any forensic history. But you would go into more detail if they had one. Education. Here we want to know both the level of education, but also the map. How long between education experiences, GED versus high school diploma, what schools, and if there were transfers and why. So when we get into like education and employment, now we really are kind of looking to get a deeper sense, because a lot of times when people are going through struggles, two of the areas where we see that affect them the most are in schooling or in work lives, right? So it can be important. If we're seeing, high school dropping out, if there's a report of a lot of difficulty in school, it might suggest a condition of ADHD. If this was something that you were thinking of adult ADHD, you would want to explore education history really well. So a little example, Stephen reports graduating high school on time. He received his BA from Hilbert College in 1997, took time after that to pursue a career as an actor. He returned to graduate school in 2010 and completed his MSW at NYU. He is currently completing his doctorate in social work from the University of Pennsylvania. So he reports that he has dyslexia, but has found ways to cope and states he enjoys learning. Like education, just what I said, you want work history, current status, any career goals. Readiness for treatment, this is a really important part, and this gets the sense that we're starting to get towards moving forward. Like we've gathered a lot of information about this individual. Now we want to start to think, is this the right place for it? Is our clinic right for them? What's their level of motivation? Where are they in their process? So example, Stephen states, I really do want to deal with this. I don't like this feeling and I want to get through this. He presents as committed and self-directed. He is at the final edge of the contemplation stage and needs help creating a plan for dealing with this issue. Now, if you were using a scale or an instrument to determine the level of stages of change, you would actually include that scale, or at least the results of that scale, in this section. Resources and responsibilities. So resources, we want to know like what is going to help our client make the most of their treatment experience, and what's going to be challenging, like what resources do they need. And then responsibility, one, how responsible do we feel they are? And then also, what responsibilities do they have in their life that might make it difficult for them to get there? So example, Steve's family and friend network is a good social support. He is employed full-time and has health insurance. He does have a lot of responsibilities that will have to be navigated to make sure he can prioritize treatment, but he seems willing to work this into his schedule. An MSE, if you were going to do a mental status exam, you would insert it in this section. For your paper, if you don't do a full MSE, at least try to put in a little brief MSE if you're able to, especially if you're working with a real client. You won't be able to do that so much with the case studies. And then a diagnosis. This is a place where you would place a preliminary diagnosis. Given the information you discovered in the assessment, you do this in the format of the DSM-5. The template, the link, is using the DSM-4. So ignore that section and use what you're learning in psychopathology to structure the diagnosis. And you don't need a preliminary diagnosis. I don't think you need it for the assignment. But if you do, you're just taking a guess, right? Like for this guy, you might be thinking general anxiety disorder. You might be thinking adjustment disorder. You might be thinking any number of things. So you will want to address that here. It should be supported by identified criteria, duration that you mentioned in the body of the assessment. So in the diagnosis, you want to kind of justify where you're going with that. And then the treatment plan. So that's the next step. So after you take all of this information, you decide what the diagnosis is. You would do what the next section of your paper is to do sort of a review of what works best with the client you just interviewed. And we'll talk about how you do that. You start to look at, what type of an approach you want to take, what type of theory you want to apply, what type of interventions. And when you get to that place, then you start to move into creating the treatment plan. Now, this is part of the biopsychosocial, but we'll address that later in the semester because it's actually literally one of your assignments. So at that point, we'll start to talk about treatment planning. So that's the biopsychosocial in a nutshell. Now, if there are any questions, I will be online during our class period. I'll wait for folks to show up for 20 minutes. It is not required. I believe the link is posted. If not, it will be posted. If you have questions about this, you want to talk a little bit more in depth about the biopsychosocial or the clients that you're working on, feel free to drop in. We can talk, for as long as needed, and hopefully, start to move forward in a really good direction for you. So I hope this was helpful to just kind of see how you frame it, how you phrase it. This was clearly like a really pinpointed one. You want to be as in-depth as possible. The example, that template example, the write-ups are terrible. The sections are accurate and sort of the information you want to get, but the way it's written is not great. So this is obviously your first shot at doing this, for me. So do the best that you can with it for the assignment. If you have questions, again, reach out to me. Make sure that we're having a constant conversation, because this is really important content for you to figure out. This is sort of like we need to know the art form of the biopsychosocial for the work we do, because social workers do so much of the assessment and structuring of clients' treatment and intervention. All right, so I hope this was helpful. Welcome some feedback. Let me know what you think of it, and if there are any questions, shoot me an email. All right, take care.